I hate those things. I'm not going to use it. I think I'm loud enough. First of all, thank you for coming this morning to the third event for Composer Showcase 2009. I have someone I have to thank before I introduce our guest for heading up this showcase this year, since I'm on something of a sabbatical from composition. Well, not really, but my colleague Charles Nichols is responsible for everything that's happening this year, and he's also the reason our mutual teacher is here. He found a way of financing this whole thing for us, and I'm very, very grateful to him. And I would like you to applaud for Charles. And now, if you've taken some, have you seen a program? No one has programs. Well, I'm not going to read our guest's biography. You need to do that at some point during his time here. It is an extraordinary honor to have this man, one of America's premier composers, with us for Showcase. As I said, he was my teacher. Charles studied with him as well. And I don't know how many, well, countless others in his career in teaching have had the privilege of learning from this man. And I'm not going to say anything more, because he can tell you everything you want to know about everyone and anything that has happened on this musical planet since, well, I don't know how long ago. I'll let him tell you about that. This is our wonderful guest, my good friend, Samuel Adler.
Thank you. Great pleasure to be here and see all those beautiful mountains and all the beautiful people living among them. I'm delighted to be here with you, and I'd like to share a few thoughts with you. Both Charles and Pat asked me to talk about my personal experience in music, why I'm a composer. I sometimes wonder about that. But the idea of starting out with this piece, it is called "Thy Song Expands My Spirit," which is a quote from Whitman. And it's dedicated to Aaron Copland, was written for his 80th birthday. The reason I had this played was because there are two incidents in my life that really shaped my life and my composition. I'm going to not do it in the order that they occurred, these two incidents, but rather having to do with this piece. When I was a graduate student at Harvard University, that place on the East Coast, I was very much under the influence of Paul Hindemith, whom I was studying with in 1949. He came to Harvard for a year, and he chose 5 students to instruct. And we had 2 lessons a week. We had to write a new piece for every lesson. Composition students, listen to this. 2 pieces a week, and it had to be finished. And sometime I could tell you about the terrible things that happened during that time. However, I was very influenced by him, and we wrote very much in his style. At the end of the year, towards, let's say, March of the next year, of 49, I had a mentor at Harvard, the great composer Irving Fine, a wonderful, wonderful composer, and he took great pity on me and also was very helpful in my development. He said, "You know, Sam, you cannot write like this all the time. You've got to get out of this idea of, you know, this counterpoint all the time, and you've got to study with Aaron Copland." I said, "Well, I'd love to." Fine. So I had all these pieces, so I sent 5 pieces to Aaron Copland. Irving Fine called him. He was a personal friend. He was actually his assistant at Tanglewood. And he said, Aaron, this is a very talented boy. You should take him. I sent my pieces. I get a letter back. Dear Mr. Adler, I think you have lots of talent, but I'm not interested in your music. I don't like it. Well, you want to know a low point in somebody's life is when America's greatest composer, most notable composer, says, forget about it. Well, I literally came to Irving Fine's office and cried. And I said, what am I going to do? I think this is the end of my career. He said, oh, I think Copeland is wrong. I'll call him. He called while I was there. He said, Aaron, I think you're wrong. This boy needs you. That's why I really want. He said, well, why don't you send him to New York and I'll talk to him. I was so poor at that time that I hitchhiked to New York. In those days, it was pretty safe. So I hitchhiked to New York. I got there, and I was supposed to meet him at the Harvard Club on Tuesday. I went there, and he was very gracious, very nice. We had a wonderful lunch. I said, I've got it made. This guy is very gregarious. It's wonderful. Then we went into this very large room, and I stood over here. He walked over to the piano, and he played. He said, what's that? I said, it's a C major triad. He said, Sam, I'm not trying to find out whether you have perfect pitch. What is it? I said, I'm sorry, Mr. Copeland. It's a C major triad. He said, yes, but do you love it? I said, well, not particularly. He said, that's what's wrong with your music. You have to love every note. Every note you put down, you have to love. Ladies and gentlemen, changed my life. He took me as a student. We had hell to pay in the summer. He taught, he criticized every note over and over again. And finally, I was the only one in the class that wrote a new piece. Everybody brought in old pieces. I wrote a new piece. I'll still remember it. It was called American Comedy Overture for full orchestra. I brought it in. We went through it the last time, the last lesson. He said, you know, Sam, this is a very good piece. I said, I'm sorry, Mr. Copeland, but I disagree. I think it's pretty bad. He said, you see, that's why it's so good, because for the first time you recognize how bad it is. Well, it went downhill from that time on. Because the next year he said I should study with him again, and I did, but he said, Sam, you're an excellent conductor. You should give up composition, you should conduct. I want you to study conducting with Koussevitzky and Bernstein and forget about. I said, no, I really want to study. So we went through another hellish summer, but it got better. And after the summer, I was drafted. I had gotten my degree, and the day after my degree, I was drafted. In those days, we all were drafted. So I said, at the end of the summer, Mr. Copeland, would you do me a favor and give me a letter of recommendation? When I get out of the Army, I'll need it. He said, Sam, you know, I like you, and I hope we'll stay in touch and you'll live through the Army. And then I want to see what's going to happen to you as a composer. I'm not quite sure you're going to be a composer. So I really can't give you a letter of recommendation. Well, the letter of recommendation came, but it came 10 years later. I didn't need it anymore, but there was something else. For his 80th birthday, they did a concert of all his piano music at the Library of Congress, and he was asked to name 7 students of his whom he admired and thought would be worthy of writing a piece for his 80th birthday. And after all those years, I was one of the 7 that he picked. That's why I wanted you to hear this piece. And the day after it was done, in 1980, he already was starting to have Alzheimer's. And he called me and he said, Sam, and this is Aaron. And I said, yes. And there was silence. And he said, nothing. I said, Aaron, are you still there? He said, yes, I'm trying to find out why I'm calling you. That was very sad. It was very sad. And so I said, well, you heard my piece yesterday at the concert. He says, oh, yes, and I really loved it. Well, that paid back for all those terrible years. But I tell you something. The idea that he put into my mind that you have to love every note that you put down is one that I have remembered throughout my life. The idea of beauty in music, the idea that music can change your life through the expression of beauty, has to be first that it's within you. Every one of you who are composers, every one of you who are performers, because that also goes for performers. Every note has to be beautiful. Every note has to mean something to you. You know, I teach a course in Berlin every summer, and I'm very friendly with the principal clarinetist. And I once asked him, what do you think of the Berlin Philharmonic? Well, they all love it, because they all love it that much. And it was after a concert where the principal flutist, whose name is Pahud, who is a fabulous player, he played the Nielsen in the first half. And then he did what no American flutist would do. He went back to play the second half because they were doing Brahms 4, and he wouldn't let anybody else play that flute solo in the last movement. Now, why did he do it? I asked this. He said, you see, we're not better than any other orchestra. But the difference between every other orchestra and us is we love every note we play, and we love this music. It becomes a visceral experience for us. Now, I want you to remember that. If you remember nothing else of my visit, I want you to remember the idea that music has the power, because of its intense beauty and because of its abstract nature, to change our lives. Now, there's one more incident in my life, and it is not such a beautiful one, but a dramatic one, which I will tell you because it also changed my life. And it happened when I was 10 years old. I was born in Mannheim, Germany, by the way, in the house where Mozart lived. So I couldn't be anything but a composer. My mother told me. And you see, Mannheim was the favorite orchestra of Mozart, and there's a big history, and it also goes up to this time. And at that time, my father was a cantor. He was the chief cantor of the Central Synagogue in Mannheim, and he was also a composer and a fabulous pianist. We played sonatas every day from the time I was 11 to the time I went to college. We played 2 hours every day from Bach to Bartók, everything you can imagine. This was a great upbringing. However, this incident also decided something different in my life, and it was this. He hated this 19th century music that was traditional in the synagogue, and he changed the harmony, and he changed this and that, and the board hated it. Because just like in Bach's time, they wanted everything to be like it was. Well, my father didn't like that, and he did something very smart. He married my mother, because otherwise he would have been fired. My mother's father was on the board, and you don't fire a board member's son-in-law. So he went through it. And he never came to terms with this music. Well, I don't know how many of you know the history of Nazi Germany, but in November 1938, we reached a spot, but maybe the low point of that era, the Kristallnacht, in which the Nazis destroyed every synagogue in Germany and went into the houses and threw down the crystal. That's why it's called Kristallnacht. And it was a disastrous kind of thing. And they arrested 60,000 men and put them into concentration camps. One of the people arrested was my father. And after 4 days, President Roosevelt pulled back the American ambassador from Berlin and said, with barbarians that do such horrible things to their own citizens, we cannot deal. So the Germans, the Nazis, in order to have some reconciliation with America, they let go all the 60,000 men. But because my father was a clergyman, he was told if he doesn't leave in 10 days, he's in for good. Well, he came home, and we did leave in 10 days, but before we left, he said, you know, we've got to rescue the music of the Mannheim synagogue and take it with us to America. Now, this is the man who couldn't stand that music. So he told my mother, I'm going to take Sam and we'll go into the synagogue, which was partially destroyed. The east wall was down, and there was a charge put under the organ, which hung over the gallery. The organ hung over the gallery by one big cable. And my mother I said, they're going to kill you. I mean, there is SS in there because it's not a safe building and so on and so forth. Well, he always had his way. We went to the choir loft through a tunnel that he knew about. We got up there, and you can't imagine. There was a very large choir loft, but you can't imagine the terrible destruction. And there were books all over in parts and so on. We did gather all the 17-part books. At that moment, because there was nothing but dust and coal and this and that, I sneezed. The captain, we heard him say very carefully, go upstairs and shoot at sight. At that moment, ladies and gentlemen, the organ fell down. And I'm here. Whether anybody was hit by the organ, that's not the case. The case was that they didn't come upstairs. We escaped with the music, and we were able to come to America. This moment was a deciding moment, not at that point, but many years later, because I feel that there is a mission for me, and that is to try and influence people for good. I have tried to do that all my life, and I think this is the survivor's mission. I really feel that we survived for a reason. And my whole creative life is influenced by these two things: the idea of a survivor and the idea of trying to bring some kind of beauty to the world. Well, beauty is in the view of the beholder, you see, because everybody thinks beauty is something very personal, which it is. So one can only do what one feels is important in one's music. And to me, the most important thing is, and I think this is true of all music, past and present, the composers that really speak to an audience are composers who try to translate the vigor, vim, and also the tragedy of our own time in their music. It has to really mean something. I think we're living in the most exciting times ever, not only musically, but in every other way. What science and medicine is doing is incredible and unthought of before. At the same time, we're living with the greatest threat for all humanity. Not only the global warming, but also we have the weapons to destroy the entire world. This dichotomy, to me, is something so vigorous that it pervades all of my music. I think we have to have times of meditation when we feel that life is not only worth living, but worth meditating upon. That our mission is to do the very best at all times. And then We have times when we translate the great energy of our time, which is greater perhaps than at any time in human history. And if we look back and look at the great masters of the past in our own field, I don't think you can ever put into words what elegance means. But when you hear a piece of Mozart, you feel what elegance feels like. When you hear a Beethoven symphony, the power of human destiny comes through with every note. That's true of the 19th century, it's true of the 20th century. Unfortunately, we have forgotten that the 20th century has produced more great music than any other century, only we don't know it enough. For instance, my teacher at Harvard before Hindemith was Walter Piston, one of the really great composers of my lifetime. He's written 8 symphonies. It is so bad that the Chicago Symphony started its season last season with the 2nd Symphony of Piston, which had never been played in Chicago. It had been written in 1932 and was not played in Chicago until '07. Now that's pretty sad. We have to get into a position of pride for the music that has been written in America. We have had more great symphonists in America in the 20th century than all other countries put together. However, I'm not going to test you, but I just want to throw out a question. How many of you know the symphonies of Piston, of Sessions, of all the other composers, Schumann, Persichetti, etc.? Very few. And yet, we have this body, and we as American students should know this music, should perform this music, because it is as good as any other. Shostakovich, Prokofiev, we all know the Russians. We don't know ourselves. And I think we could find strength in this music, and for you composers, a newfound freedom which these people had in their music. There's a wonderful recording Bernstein made of 3rd symphonies. The 3rd Symphony of Harris, the 3rd Symphony of William Schumann, and the 3rd Symphony of Aaron Copland. I think they can rival any symphonies of the 20th century, including all the great masters. You see, I think we have a mission as American students, faculty, and composers, performers, to say something to our people which means something, because these people lived here, lived the American experience, and were able to translate it into great music. I think those of us who go into music education are very important people, because I think music education in America is sorely lacking vitality these days. We do nothing but pop to please the crowd, and so music becomes entertainment. And the first thing that's cut out of the school systems is music, and I applaud that, because entertainment you don't need in school. You need mathematics, you need history, you need English, you need all kinds of things. Because we have made music an entertainment is why music is not being taken seriously. And it is our task as music students today to reverse that. And I'm talking to you to be activists. And the first activist thing you can do is, well, I don't know anything about the University of Montana, and maybe that's not true of the University of Montana. But I have been around this country. I've been to at least 500 universities. And I see in every concert that's given, especially new music concerts, that nobody comes. Maybe 25 people. Not even the music students come. Well, what do you do about it? I'll tell you what to do. It is our task as music students to go out where they are, where the people are, You know who's going to pay for symphony orchestras, opera companies, string quartets, woodwind quintets in the future? It's people who are going to school here, and they never hear any music. Because the music school is an isolated place in which you all have a good time, and you perform for one another. That's incestuous. What to do is to form small groups, go into the dormitories, if there are any here, and I'm sure there are, play for the kids who don't come to music school, and say to them, listen, I'm giving a recital, come to my recital. But if they have never heard live music, which most of them have not, except for rock concerts, they won't come. Why should they? And I tell you an incident. I was guest composer for 10 days at the University of South Florida in Tampa. It was in February. The weather was gorgeous. Everybody had lunch outside. Well, the first thing that came about was I had to go to a faculty meeting, which I want to tell you, the greatest thing about retirement is I never have to go to another meeting in my life. But I had to go to this faculty meeting. Everybody was belly aching. They had had the Juilliard Quartet, and in a hall that seats 1,800, 300 people came. They were devastated. And they were going to have the Guarneris in another month. They're going to have a financial disaster. So I said, why are you surprised at this? Well, I mean, it's the Juilliard Quartet. Well, I was at that time at Eastman. I could have said you could have had the Eastman Quartet. Everybody would have come. But I didn't say that. I didn't do it. I didn't say it. I said, why should the kids spend $5 to go to a concert of string quartet? They've never heard a string quartet. They don't know what it's going to sound. They're going to be bored. So they said, well, what do you suggest? I said, very simple. We'll form, in the music school, during the next 10 days, we'll form as many string quartets as we can, as many woodwind quintets, brass quintets, and a madrigal group, and a jazz group. And we'll send them all over. They'll play at noon when people are outside eating lunch. They'll play all over the place. Well, we did that. And I said, I talked to the kids and gave them orientation. I said the most important thing is you must get to talk to these people. If they say, gee, that's nice, will you play it again? You play it again. And you say, you want to hear this again? So you engage in conversation. Well, I tell you, the outcome of this was fabulous. And what was it? Well, they loved this business of going around and everybody playing and singing and wonderful. When the Guarneris came, they had a sold-out house because they now knew what they were going to. And these kids said to them, you think we're good, you should hear the Guarneris. And they actually sold tickets after they played. This was the most successful thing. Unfortunately, it died after I left. And I'm always, as a matter of fact, I'm going back there in 2 weeks, not to the university, but to Tampa. And I had a letter from one of them last week, for one of the professors, and they said, you know, Sam, we're trying to get going again what you did when you were here. And this was 12 years ago. But you know, this is what we need. We need activism. We don't need for you to sit and practice 8 hours a day. Practice 6 hours a day and go out and play for 2 hours. I mean, the whole thing is that, of course, it's important to practice, but the idea of making music outside, and that is what I have always written a piece for a person or for a group. I never write a piece for anybody or any group that I don't hear first. And then I make it personal. You know, I've written now 19 solo pieces, I call them concert etudes for different instruments. And I feel, I didn't want to have any kind of competition with Mr. Hindemith, who wrote sonatas for every instrument. I'll be a little humble and write just solo pieces. But the thing is this, it's very important that the person you write for feels a commitment on your part that this piece will show off the best in you. That has been the criteria for most things. This piece was written, the little piano piece was written, I knew the performer, she was a terrific pianist, as was the performer this morning, who played fantastically well. And she played all of Copland's music that afternoon, as well as these 7 little pieces. And I wrote it for her. Now, I'm sure those of you who know Copland's music recognize that the first introduction was based on that famous chord from Appalachian Spring, which is one of my favorite chords, and which you can't ever write unless you're writing something for Copland, because everybody recognizes and says, listen, get your own chords. But anyway, the idea was that I wanted to connect somehow with him. But I wrote it for this woman who I knew very well, and I knew she could play beautifully. That's the way to write. Now, I have advice for all you composers. Now, I've heard quite a few of your pieces, and I think what you need to do is to be a little more adventuresome and know a lot of music. You see, as a student, you need to imitate. It's not a bad thing. Look, I'll tell you a story. When we finished studying with Hindemith, he was very happy to go back to Yale. We never forgave him for that, but he was. Mrs. Hindemith asked the 5 of us who studied with him to come over for coffee on Sunday afternoon, and we came over there, and she was a fabulous baker. 30 years later, she even remembered what my favorite cake was, and it's gooseberry pie. And she made one when I saw her 30 years later. So it's just really terrific lady. Anyway, so we went over there, and we had a good time. He was in a good mood. Not always in a good mood, but he was that afternoon. Until somebody asked him, Mr. Hindemith, why did you make us write in your style only? I thought, oh, come on, leave it alone. He gave an answer that I will give to you, which is a fantastic one. He said, how did Bach learn how to write? Did he go to a music school, conservatory? No. At 8, he was sent to his uncle, whatever his name was, Ludwig, I think, and he was his apprentice. He copied his music. He listened to all the services. That he was also an organist and a choir master and a teacher. Well, when he was 10, Uncle Ludwig got sick for a week. And he said, Johann, you write the chorale prelude for next Sunday. Now, what style did he write in? Well, Uncle Ludwig's, that's the style he knew. And he had lots of chops, because he knew now what Uncle Ludwig would do. Another time, he got sick and said, you do the cantata. Now, what style did he write in? Uncle Ludwig's. Now, he also had a personality of his own. So he took Uncle Ludwig's, and I have to say in parentheses, he said to the guy, Claudio, which you don't have, he had a personality of his own, so he went out, and at 14, he wrote with Uncle Ludwig's chops and his personality a new kind of music. But if you don't have a technique, you can't write music. It's like practicing the violin, or practicing the flute, or practicing the piano. You have to practice, and the way to practice is to imitate. Then if you have a personality, you will have something original, because you have the technique. Well, I'm going to end with a couple of things I want you to remember, a couple of very excellent quotes. And then we have time to ask a few questions, and I hope you have some. The first one is about talent and genius. You know, every one of you here has talent, And that's great. Schopenhauer once put it this way: talent is like the marksman who hits a target which others cannot reach. Genius is like a marksman who hits a target that others can't even see. And that is what I wish for you. Because George Bernard Shaw once put it very beautifully. He said, most people see things and ask why. I dream dreams and ask why not. It is that which I want your music education to be the sum of. That you dream dreams and ask why not and go out and do them. Be proactive and go into the community and do something, because music can change people's lives. And you who have that talent and that genius can do that for our country that needs it desperately. Maybe not in Montana, but the rest of the country does. Thank you very much. Thank you. Let's have some questions. Oh, come on. Yes.
When you were writing pieces for soloists, how did you decide who you'd write it for? Like, if you met someone, how would you decide, oh, I want to write something specifically for this person?
Well, I'm happy to say that I have lots of friends in the business, and I write for them. And they happen to be some of the very best players in the world, and I only write for them. And so the pieces are tailor-made. Well, I have been lucky in my life to have had commissions, let's say, from the Cleveland Orchestra, and the first clarinetist came up to me and said, Sam, I just love your cello concerto. You've never written a piece for clarinet. Why don't you write a piece for me? So there's the canto for clarinet written for the principal. Or Leonard Slatkin did a piece his last year in St. Louis, and the piccolo player came up to me, Jan Gippo, and said, Sam, you haven't written a piece for piccolo. I think you should write a piccolo concerto. I said, well, if the St. Louis Symphony will bring up the money, then maybe. And he said, no, we're broke, and so on. So I said, well, I'll write you a solo piece. And that's how things like that happen. You know, and while you're in school, when I was a composer in my undergraduate career, I fell in love with a horn player, and I wrote nothing but brass music. You see, that's how you do it. I mean, music is love, and that's what it is. Yes, yes, ma'am.
I just wanted to ask, you spoke earlier of American composers whose works have been underplayed or unplayed, and let me turn that question to you about your work. Are there any works of yours that you would love to hear publicly that have not been played, or any?
Well, I'm happy to say all have been played at least once, but this is always the sorrow of a composer. I mean, especially a composer who's written too much music like me. You always say, why doesn't this orchestra play my 6 symphonies? Well, they're not going to. I mean, you get to a point where you say, if I have 1 or 2 major orchestra performances a year, I'm very lucky. Because you have to also recognize that there are many, many very good composers in America. And some pieces are played, and it goes in cycles. We go through cycles of, during the 60s and 70s, orchestras didn't play any new music because it was too complex. We were in the serial 12-tone period when everything was very complex, and so we had little new music groups that played all those pieces. Well, I was never for that because I'm against anesthetizing new music, and that's what I think new music groups do. They play the latest things, but they don't play something was written yesterday. They play something that's written tomorrow. But the idea of Sure. As a matter of fact, the saddest part is opera. I've written 5 one-act operas. And when they were first written, they were done. As a matter of fact, the first one was written for NBC television. So, I mean, that's great. Now, they lie on the shelf. And it is sad for a composer. But look, I'm not complaining. I get my share, and I have to be satisfied with that. It's also what you write. I mean, you write a piano concerto, and you wait between performances. You might even die between performances. You write something for flute, and it's played. You write something for saxophone, and it's played. You write something for percussion, and you hear too many performances, you know. But you write something for violin or piano or voice. Well, we have to sing Schubert. I'm all for it. I love Schubert. I'm sure, I know he's a better composer than I. But you know, I've written about 100 songs too, and they get sung every once in a while. As a matter of fact, I can't complain. I go around this country a great deal. I mean, last year was my 80th birthday, and we had 34 concerts of my music, and I really can't complain about that, you know. I mean, that's a really wonderful thing, and some of the best performances I've ever heard of them, now by young people, you know, and that makes one very happy. I must tell you that if I had my life to live over again, I wouldn't want to change a day. And that's, not many people can say that. It's been the greatest life in music, and I wish it to everyone. Another question? Yes?
I was just wondering if you could elaborate on how being Jewish and the Oregon incident, how that has influenced your compositions.
Well, that's a very good question. I think I'm going to answer what Bloch said. You know, he was always called the Jewish composer because he wrote so many pieces with Hebrew titles and things like that. And he said, I'm not a Jewish composer, I'm a composer who happens to be Jewish. And I feel the same way. Now, what has influenced me is, of course, the commissions. And also my first job. My first job was music director of Temple Emmanuel in Dallas, Texas, which is now the largest Jewish congregation in the world. And it was at that time a very vital place, and the rabbi was very much into music. He said once to me, if you don't sing a great anthem before my sermon, I can't get up and speak. And boy, we used to do Bach cantatas and things like that before the sermon. And what has influenced me is many commissions from both synagogue and church to write liturgical music. And since my father was a composer of liturgical music, it was in my blood, I guess. And I've written so much of that music. The tradition has influenced me. For instance, chant has had a great influence. If you were here last night and heard the piece Reconciliation, there's one section where the flute and clarinet play in octaves, and it is a quotation from the chant from Lamentations. So I'm very conscious of the ancient music especially, and the tradition that has grown up in the way you chant the Bible. I'm always influenced also, because I studied it very carefully when I was an undergraduate, of Gregorian chant and Anglican chant, which also has influenced some of my music. So the liturgy as well as religious thoughts have always been very much on my mind. We can have one more question. Yes, sir.
You speak of writing 100 songs or so. I'm wondering if you might speak to the influence of literature and the word and how you go about selecting the text.
Very good question. I am a constant reader. And the greatness about my house or our house today in Perrysburg, Ohio, is that I have, for the first time in my life, a library. And one wall is 500 books of poetry. and I constantly read those. I have a backlog. If you ask me to write songs, I know exactly what I want to do next, you know. And the idea of, I think, one needs to constantly read. The only thing I don't read is fiction. I get bored by it. I've read too much in my youth, but I read a lot of history and biography and philosophy and so on, but I read a great deal of poetry, so I'm always ready to set another and then I have a lot of friends who are poets. I just did a great poet in Iowa, Donald Justice, who just died last year. I wrote a song cycle for Renee Fleming on his poetry, and I just heard one of the most beautiful performances I could ever imagine, not by Renee, but by one of her classmates at Eastman, Pam Coburn, who is just the greatest singer, and she did them. And you know, the voice is really the greatest instrument because it is our own. It's built in. And I've always loved the voice. I was brought up on Schubert songs. My mother was a singer, and not professionally, but she knew the whole literature. And from the time I was 3 years old, I could sing Sah ein Knab ein Röslein stehen, or Auf dem Wasser zu singen, and things like that, because she sang them to me. Those were my lullabies, Schumann, Dichterliebe, and things like that. So I grew up on it, and I think that's the greatest literature that we have. The last songs of Strauss and pieces like that have greatly influenced me, although my songs aren't in that style. But you know, I've written a work for woodwind quintet and soprano, a work for wind ensemble and soprano, all kinds of things, and of course also lots of liturgical music. I have to tell you, I haven't seen it yet, but I just had an email this morning that a volume has come out of 10 songs of my father's and 10 songs of mine, which makes me very happy. I guess we have to quit because but I could go on if you have other questions. I don't have to go anyplace. Any other burning questions? If not, thank you very much.